Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to medieval England, to a world of smoky kitchens and great feasting halls, in one of the strangest corners of that whole strange world, the food. For the people of the Middle Ages ate some genuinely peculiar things. They cooked up dishes that would make a modern stomach turn a slow and thoughtful somersault. They combined flavors that we would never dream of putting together. They served up creatures we would never think to eat. And they did the most extraordinary things in the name of a good dinner. Some of it was clever, some of it was surprisingly nice, and some of it, if we are honest, sounds absolutely revolting. And tonight, in the gentlest and most soothing way imaginable, we are going to wander through the worst, the weirdest, and the most wonderfully off-putting of the medieval kitchen, and marvel at what people once happily sat down to eat. Now, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere, and thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps carry you off to sleep, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries to the medieval kitchen and all the strange things bubbling away in its pots. You do not need to remember any of it. Everything tonight is gently told, a quiet and curious and faintly ridiculous history held at a soft and comfortable distance, a story to drift away to. Have you ever wondered what people actually ate in the Middle Ages? In the long centuries before the foods we know today, before the potato and the tomato and the comforting cup of tea, have you ever wondered what strange creatures they roasted, what odd flavors they mixed, what alarming dishes they set proudly before their guests? Have you ever wondered what the very worst of medieval cooking might have tasted like, and why on earth anyone thought to make it? These are the things we are going to drift through tonight, slowly and gently, in the dark, the strange and weird and wonderfully off-putting world of medieval food. So settle back, let your eyes grow heavy, and let us wander together, softly, into the smoky old kitchen of the Middle Ages. Let us begin, gently, with the single thing that made medieval food strangest of all to modern tastes, their absolute obsession with spice. If you were to sit down at a grand medieval table and take a mouthful of the finest, most expensive, most admired dish the kitchen could produce, the very first thing you would notice, before anything else, is that it was spiced within an inch of its life. For the wealthy of the Middle Ages were absolutely obsessed with spice, piling it onto their food with a lavish, almost reckless enthusiasm that would leave a modern diner reeling. And this single fact does more than any other to explain why so much medieval food would taste, to us, so very strange. So let us begin our wander here, in a cloud of pepper and ginger and cinnamon, at the heart of the medieval kitchen's strangest habit. The wealthy medieval household used spices in quantities that seem, to us, frankly astonishing, seasoning their dishes with a heavy hand that went far beyond anything we would consider reasonable. Pepper and ginger, cinnamon and cloves, nutmeg and mace and grains of paradise, all were flung into the pot with tremendous generosity, layered one atop another, until the original flavor of the food beneath was all but buried under a great heap of seasoning. A single dish might contain a whole cupboard's worth of different spices, combined in ways that we would find overwhelming, the food serving almost as a mere vehicle for the spectacular quantity of seasoning heaped upon it. To the medieval palate, at least among the wealthy, more spice was simply better, and restraint in the matter was neither expected nor admired. The reason for this great obsession lay largely in what spices meant to the medieval world, for they were fabulously expensive, exotic treasures carried from the far ends of the earth, and to serve heavily spiced food was to display one's wealth in the most direct and delicious way imaginable. Spices came from distant lands, passing through many hands on their long journey to the medieval table, and by the time they arrived, they were worth extraordinary sums, luxuries that only the wealthy could afford. To pile them onto one's food, then, was to show off, to announce to one's guests that one could afford to be lavish with these precious and exotic goods. The heavily spiced dish was a statement of status, a way of displaying one's wealth and importance, and the more spice, the grander the statement. It was, in a sense, less about flavour than about showing off, the medieval equivalent of gilding one's dinner. There is an old idea, which you may have heard, that all this spice was used to disguise the taste of meat that had gone off, that the medieval cook drowned his rotten meat in seasoning to hide the fact that it was no longer fit to eat. It is a wonderfully vivid notion, and it is almost certainly nonsense. The truth is that spices were far too expensive to waste on spoiled meat, and anyone wealthy enough to afford such lavish spicing was wealthy enough to afford fresh meat in the first place. Nobody was sprinkling fortunes in pepper over a joint that had turned. They were sprinkling it over perfectly good food to show that they could. So we may set that old story gently aside, even as we marvel at the sheer quantity of seasoning involved. The spicing was for splendour, not for disguise. The result of all this, for our purposes tonight, is that the grandest medieval food, the food that the wealthy were proudest of and admired most, was often spiced to a degree that we would find genuinely unpleasant, a great overwhelming blast of mixed seasonings that buried the food beneath it. To get a proper sense of it, imagine a single dish that has been treated with pepper and ginger and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, then sweetened with sugar and studded with dried fruit, then sharpened with a good splash of sour verjuice, then coloured a startling yellow with saffron, and perhaps finished with a little gold leaf on top, all at once, all in the same bowl. That is not an exaggeration, but a fair description of the sort of thing a medieval gourmet considered the very height of fine dining. Every flavour the kitchen possessed was piled into the one dish, each fighting the others for attention, the poor scrap of meat at the bottom of it all, quite lost beneath the avalanche of seasoning. To the medieval palate, this was richness and splendour and delight. To ours, it would be a bewildering, mouth-filling muddle, the culinary equivalent of every instrument in the orchestra playing a different tune at full volume all at once. A modern diner, presented with one of these prized dishes, would very likely find it far too much. A confusing muddle of clashing spices piled on with no restraint at all. What the medieval gourmet considered the height of good eating, we would consider a bit of an assault. And this is our first great lesson in the strangeness of medieval food, that their very idea of a fine and admirable dish was one that we would probably find almost inedible, not because it was bad, exactly, but because it was seasoned according to a taste utterly unlike our own. Let that first strange mouthful settle gently in the dark. We turn now to another of the medieval kitchen's stranger habits, its curious love of mixing the sweet with the savoury. Once you have got past the sheer quantity of spice, the next thing that would strike you as deeply strange about a medieval meal is the medieval cook's cheerful willingness to mix sweet and savoury flavours together in ways that would make a modern diner pause, fork halfway to the mouth, and quietly put it down again. For the Middle Ages drew none of the firm lines we draw between the sweet and the savoury, and the results, while sometimes rather nice, could also be genuinely baffling. Let us wander into this sugary, meaty muddle and see what we find. The medieval cook thought nothing of sweetening dishes that we would firmly expect to be savoury, adding sugar and honey and dried fruit to meats and fish, and all manner of things that we would prefer to leave well alone. A dish of meat might be studded with raisins and dates, sweetened with honey, and dusted with sugar, the whole thing sitting somewhere between a dinner and a dessert in a way that we would find rather unsettling. Sugar, in particular, when it could be had, was treated almost as a spice, sprinkled over savoury dishes with the same enthusiasm as pepper, so that the line between the sweet course and the savoury course, so clear to us, simply did not exist in the same way. To the medieval diner, a sweetened meat dish was perfectly normal. To us, it sounds like something has gone rather wrong in the kitchen. This blurring of sweet and savoury ran all through medieval cooking, appearing in the most unexpected places and combining flavours that we keep strictly and sensibly apart. Fish might be cooked in a sweet sauce, meat might be simmered with fruit, a single dish might combine sugar, vinegar, spice, and meat all at once, sweet and sour and savoury and hot, all fighting for attention in the same mouthful. The medieval palate seems to have delighted in these combinations, in the piling together of flavours that we would consider fundamentally incompatible. And the grander the dish, the more likely it was to contain some startling marriage of the sweet and the savoury. It was a cuisine with no firm rules about which flavours belonged together, and the results could be, to modern tastes, thoroughly confusing. Some of these combinations, it must be said in fairness, were not entirely without merit, and a few of them survive in gentler forms to this day. In the sauces we still serve with certain meats, in the fruit we still pair with certain dishes. The idea of a sweet accompaniment to a savoury meat is not, in itself, absurd, and here and there the medieval cook stumbled onto pairings that genuinely worked, and that we still enjoy in modified form. So we should not be entirely unkind about the whole enterprise. Buried within the muddle were some real successes, some combinations that have stood the test of time. But these were the exceptions, the happy accidents, and for every pairing that worked, there were a dozen that would strike us as thoroughly misguided. For the most part, though, the medieval enthusiasm for mixing sweet and savoury produced dishes that would leave a modern diner deeply confused, unable to decide whether they were eating a main course or a pudding, and rather wishing they were eating neither. A great sweetened, spiced, fruited meat dish, presented as the height of the cook's art, would strike us as a strange and unwelcome hybrid, neither one thing nor the other, a violation of the sensible boundaries we keep between our courses. And so we add it to our growing list of medieval culinary strangenesses. Not content with burying their food in spice, they also could not be trusted to keep the sugar away from the meat. Let that sweet and savoury muddle settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the actual creatures that found their way onto the medieval plate, some of which will surprise you a great deal. Now we come to a part of the medieval meal that requires a slightly stronger stomach, though I promise to be gentle with you, for the people of the Middle Ages ate parts of the animal that most of us today would very firmly decline, and they ate them with relish. For where we have become rather squeamish, preferring our meat in neat, anonymous cuts with all the alarming bits safely out of sight, the medieval cook wasted nothing and thought nothing of serving up the innards, the organs, and the odds and ends that we would rather not think about at all. Let us peer, with a raised eyebrow, into this offally business. The medieval kitchen made full and enthusiastic use of what we politely call offal, the internal organs and less fashionable parts of the animal, treating them not as scraps to be discarded, but as perfectly good food to be cooked and eaten. Livers and kidneys, hearts and lungs, tripe and brains and all the rest, the various inner workings of the beast were all fair game, cooked up into pies and puddings and stews, and served without the slightest embarrassment. In a world where meat was precious and waste was folly, nothing was thrown away, and every part of the animal, however alarming, found its way into some dish or other. The medieval diner tucked into a plate of organs with an appetite that would rather startle most of us today. There was a particular medieval fondness for a dish made from the innards of the deer, the various internal bits left over after the good cuts had been taken, all cooked together into a sort of pie. These umbles, as the innards were called, were baked up into an umble pie, a dish of the humbler parts of the animal, eaten by those who were not grand enough to claim the finer cuts. It is from this very dish, in fact, that we get our expression about eating humble pie, about being humbled and having to accept a lowly portion, though the words have drifted a little over the centuries. The next time you hear someone speak of eating humble pie, you may think of the medieval huntsman's leftovers, baked into a pastry and served to the lower orders, and feel rather glad you were not among them. The medieval cook also made great use of blood, which we would very firmly rather not have on our plates, cooking it into puddings and using it to thicken and colour various dishes. Blood puddings and dishes darkened and thickened with blood were a normal part of the medieval diet, another instance of the sensible medieval refusal to waste anything at all, however much it might turn a modern stomach. We shall not dwell on this, for I did promise to be gentle, but it belongs on our list of the alarming things the medieval kitchen happily served up. Another reminder of how much more robust the medieval diner's appetite was than our own delicate modern one. All of this reflects a world in which meat was too precious to waste, and squeamishness was a luxury few could afford, a world that made full use of the whole animal and thought nothing of eating the parts we now discard or hide away. The medieval diner was not disgusted by offal because the medieval diner could not afford to be, and what strikes us as alarming struck them as simply sensible, the obvious way to make the most of a valuable animal. So while a plate of medieval innards might make us go a little pale, we might also spare a moment of respect for a people who wasted nothing and turned every last bit of the beast into dinner. Though we would still, I think, rather not have the tripe, nor the brains, nor indeed most of the rest of it, however sensible and thrifty it may have been. Let that offally business settle gently in the dark. We turn now to one of the most gloriously ridiculous of all medieval dishes, the bird dressed up to look alive. We come now to one of the most gloriously absurd creations of the entire medieval kitchen, a dish so theatrical, so impractical, and so thoroughly ridiculous that it is almost impossible not to admire it, even as we would very firmly decline to eat it. For at the grandest medieval feasts, the cook would take a magnificent bird, roast it, and then dress it back up in its own skin and feathers, so that it arrived at the table looking, more or less, alive. Let us marvel gently at this splendid piece of culinary theatre. The great showpiece birds of the medieval feast, and above all the peacock, were prepared in the most elaborate and extraordinary way, for the cook would carefully remove the skin, with all its feathers still attached, roast the bird, and then fit the feathered skin back over the cooked flesh before sending it out to the hall. The result was a roasted peacock that appeared to be sitting there in all its living glory, tail fanned out in a great shimmering display, as though it might at any moment stand up and walk off the table. Sometimes the beak was even gilded, or a little flame was set burning in its mouth, to add to the spectacle. It was less a dish than a performance, a magnificent centerpiece designed to astonish the guests and display the wealth and grandeur of the host. The trouble with all this splendour, and the reason it concerns us tonight, is that the peacock, for all its magnificent appearance, is by most accounts really rather unpleasant to eat. The flesh of the peacock was said to be tough, dry, and stringy, a disappointing and chewy mouthful entirely unworthy of its spectacular presentation, so that the great feathered showpiece was very often more admired than enjoyed. The guests would marvel at the sight of it, praise its beauty, and then discover, upon actually tasting it, that they had been served a mouthful of dry and stringy disappointment. The peacock was, in short, all show and no substance, a dish that looked like a king and tasted like an old boot. The guests, of course, were far too polite and far too impressed by the spectacle to complain, and so they chewed their way manfully through the dry and stringy flesh, praising its magnificence between mouthfuls, while quietly wishing they had been served a nice bit of chicken instead. This did not, however, discourage the medieval feast-giver in the slightest, for the whole point of the peacock was never really to be delicious, but to be impressive, to astonish the guests and display the host's magnificence. The eating of the thing was almost beside the point. What mattered was the great gasp of admiration when the feathered bird was carried in, the spectacle and the status and the sheer theatrical grandeur of it. That it tasted like dry string was a minor detail, easily overlooked in the glow of all that splendour. And so the peacock continued to grace the grandest tables, admired by all, enjoyed by few, a triumph of presentation over palatability. The peacock was not alone in this, for other great birds received similar treatment, dressed and displayed and served up for spectacle rather than flavour, the medieval feast delighting in food that looked astonishing, whatever it actually tasted like. This tells us something rather important about the grand medieval meal, that it was, to a remarkable degree, about the show. The medieval feast was theatre as much as dinner, a performance designed to impress, and if the impressive dishes happened to taste rather nasty, well, that was a small price to pay for the spectacle. And so we may add the glorious, ridiculous, dry and stringy peacock to our collection, a dish that proves the medieval table valued a good show far above a good flavour. Let that splendid feathered absurdity settle gently in the dark. We turn now to an even stranger piece of feast day theatre, the pie that was full of surprises. You will almost certainly know the old nursery rhyme about the 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, that when the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. It is one of those daft little verses we learn as children and never think about again. But tonight, I must tell you something rather wonderful, which is that this was, more or less, a real thing that medieval and later cooks actually did, and it belongs firmly among the strangest theatrical creations of the grand old kitchen. Let us wander gently into the peculiar business of the surprise pie. The medieval and Tudor feast delighted in dishes that contained a hidden surprise, and among the most famous was the pie that, when cut open, released a flurry of live birds into the hall. The cook would prepare a great pie crust, bake it empty, and then place living birds inside just before it was carried out, so that when the guest of honour cut into it, the birds would burst forth in a great startling flutter of wings, to the astonishment and delight of the company. It was a piece of pure theatre, a practical joke baked into a pie, designed to produce a moment of chaos and wonder at the feast. The rhyme, it turns out, was barely an exaggeration at all. These surprise pies were not, of course, meant to be eaten, at least not the birds, which flew off around the hall in a panic while the guests laughed and marvelled. The whole point was the spectacle, the great dramatic reveal, the moment of astonishment when the pie disgorged its living contents. Sometimes it was not birds but other creatures, frogs or other small animals, that were concealed within, all to the same end of startling and entertaining the guests. The surprise pie was a centrepiece of the grand feast's entertainment, a way of turning dinner into a show, and it reveals once again the medieval delight in food as theatre, as spectacle, as a source of astonishment rather than mere nourishment. We might pause to feel a little sorry for the birds, who can hardly have enjoyed their brief imprisonment in a pie crust, though I promised not to dwell on anything upsetting, so we shall simply note it gently and move on. And we might also spare a thought for the practical difficulties of the thing, the challenge of getting a quantity of live birds into a pie and out again at exactly the right moment, without either baking them or losing them prematurely. It cannot have been an easy trick to pull off, and one imagines it went wrong as often as it went right, with birds escaping early or refusing to fly out on cue. But when it worked, it must have been quite a sight. The surprise pie, like the feathered peacock, tells us that the grand medieval feast was above all a performance, a spectacle designed to astonish and entertain, in which the actual eating of the food was often the least important part. The wealthy medieval host wanted to amaze his guests, to give them something to talk about, and a pie full of live birds certainly did that. It is a wonderfully daft and theatrical notion, the surprise pie, and it reminds us that for all its strangeness, the medieval feast was also tremendous fun, a place of wonder and spectacle and delightful absurdity. And it means that the next time you hear that old nursery rhyme, you will know that it was very nearly true. Let that fluttering, flapping absurdity settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange and slippery world of the medieval love of fish. If there was one thing that shaped the medieval diet more than any other, one great rule that governed what could be eaten and when, it was the Church's insistence on fish. For the medieval calendar was studded with fast days, days on which meat was forbidden and fish had to be eaten instead, and there were a very great many of them indeed. This meant that the medieval diner ate a truly staggering amount of fish, often of the driest and most joyless kind, and it is here that some of the grimmest eating of the whole period is to be found. Let us wade, gently, into the endless fish days. The Church forbade the eating of meat on a great many days of the year, on Fridays and often Saturdays, through the whole long season of Lent, and on numerous other fast days scattered through the calendar, adding up to something like half the days of the year. On all these days, no meat could be eaten, and fish took its place, so that the medieval diner spent a very large portion of the year eating fish, whether he liked it or not. This was not a matter of choice or preference, but of religious obligation, enforced by the Church and taken seriously by all, and it meant that fish was not an occasional treat, but a relentless, inescapable staple of the medieval diet, appearing on the table again and again and again. The great difficulty with all this fish was that fresh fish was hard to come by for most people, especially those who lived far from the sea or a river, and so the fish that most people ate was preserved fish, salted or dried or smoked, and this was where the eating became truly grim. The most notorious of these was stockfish, which was cod-dried until it was as hard as a board, a stiff and unyielding slab that had to be soaked for days and then beaten with a hammer before it could be cooked at all. Even then, it remained tough, chewy, and not very nice. A joyless and leathery mouthful that the medieval diner nonetheless ate in great quantities, because on fast days there was very little else. Salted fish, too, was fiercely salty, and often none too fresh, another grim staple of the endless meatless days. The sheer monotony of all this fish, day after day, week after week, through the long season of Lent especially, must have been genuinely dispiriting, a grey and salty tedium that the medieval diner endured as a matter of religious duty. Imagine week upon week of hammered stockfish and fierce salted herring, with no meat to break the monotony, and you begin to understand why the return of meat at the end of Lent was celebrated with such tremendous joy. The fast days were a real hardship, a long grey stretch of dull and difficult eating, and they account for a great deal of the worst that the medieval diner had to put up with. The endless fish was perhaps not the strangest medieval food, but it may well have been the most relentlessly, grindingly grim. For all this, the medieval cook did his best to make the endless fish more bearable, dressing it up with sauces and spices, disguising it where he could, trying to bring some interest to the relentless fishy fare. But there was only so much that could be done with a hammered slab of dried cod, and for most people, most of the time, the fish days were simply something to be endured. So let us spare a moment of sympathy for the medieval diner, facing yet another plate of grey and salty fish on yet another meatless day, and feel rather grateful for the freedom of our own well-stocked and unfasting tables. Let that salty, fishy tedium settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a fish, or fish-like thing, that the medieval diner genuinely loved, the strange and slippery eel. Among all the fish and fishy things that the medieval diner ate, there were two slippery creatures that he genuinely and enthusiastically loved, and that we might regard with a rather more doubtful eye, the eel and its cousin the lamprey. These wriggling, snake-like creatures were tremendously popular in the Middle Ages, eaten in great quantities and regarded as real delicacies, and one of them was even blamed for the death of a king. Let us wander, gently, into the slippery world of the medieval eel. The eel was one of the most popular foods of the entire Middle Ages, eaten everywhere and in enormous quantities, for eels were plentiful and could be caught in rivers and ponds and marshes throughout the land. They were so common and so valued that they were sometimes used almost as money, with rents and debts paid in quantities of eels, a sure sign of how important they were to the medieval table. Eels were cooked in every imaginable way, baked into pies, stewed, roasted, jellied, and served up at tables high and low, a genuine staple of medieval eating that everyone seems to have enjoyed. To the medieval diner, a good eel was a real pleasure, and there was no squeamishness at all about the creature's snake-like appearance. The lamprey, a rather more alarming cousin of the eel, was regarded as an even greater delicacy, a luxurious and prized food that the wealthy particularly esteemed. The lamprey is a strange and rather horrible-looking creature, a jawless, sucker-mouthed thing that we would very likely refuse to go near, but the medieval gourmet considered it a great treat, rich and delicious, and paid high prices for it. Lampreys were especially associated with grand eating, with feasts and luxury, and the tables of the great, and a fine lamprey dish was a thing to be prized and shown off. That such an alarming-looking creature should be so esteemed tells us a great deal about how different the medieval palate was from our own. The lamprey's most famous moment in history came when it was blamed for the death of a king, for it is said that King Henry I of England died from eating too many lampreys, a surfeit of the rich and prized delicacy, proving too much for the royal constitution. Whether this is entirely true or somewhat embellished, it has come down to us as one of the great stories of medieval eating, the king who loved lampreys so much that they killed him. It is a wonderful tale, and it captures perfectly the medieval passion for these strange, slippery creatures, a passion so great that a king would gorge himself to death on them. One imagines the royal physician's despair, warning against just one more lamprey, and being cheerfully ignored. The medieval love of eels and lampreys reveals, once again, how very different medieval tastes were from our own, how the medieval diner delighted in creatures that we would regard with real suspicion, and prized as delicacies things that we would rather not touch. These slippery, snake-like, sucker-mouthed creatures were among the most valued foods of the age, eaten with relish and paid for handsomely, and their popularity is one of the more surprising features of the whole medieval table. So the next time you pass by the eels at a fishmonger's, you may reflect that you are looking at what was once one of the most beloved foods in all of England, prized above almost all others, and fit, quite literally, to kill a king. Let that slippery delicacy settle gently in the dark. We turn now to some even stranger creatures that the medieval diner classed, rather conveniently, as fish. Here is one of my very favourite pieces of medieval culinary cleverness, a splendid bit of convenient thinking that allowed the medieval diner to enjoy a little variety amid the grim monotony of the fast days. For faced with all those endless meatless days and all that dreary salted fish, the medieval mind found some wonderfully creative ways to expand the definition of what counted as fish, and thereby to get a rather better dinner. Let us wander, with a smile, into this delightful piece of medieval rule-bending. The rule on fast days was that no meat could be eaten, only fish, but the question of what exactly counted as fish turned out to be a wonderfully flexible one, and the medieval diner interpreted it with great generosity. Anything that lived in the water, it was decided, might reasonably be called fish, and this opened up some splendid possibilities. And so creatures that are most certainly not fish found their way onto the fast day table, classed as fish by virtue of their watery habits, and eaten with a clear conscience on days when meat was forbidden. It was a marvellous piece of convenient reasoning, and it gave the medieval diner some welcome variety amid the salted herring. Among the creatures thus reclassified as fish were some genuinely surprising ones, including the porpoise and even the whale, great sea mammals that are about as far from a fish as it is possible to get, but that lived in the sea and so were declared fair game for fast days. Whale meat and porpoise were eaten in the Middle Ages, particularly by those who could afford them, enjoyed as a fast-day food that offered a hearty alternative to yet another plate of dried cod. The porpoise in particular was considered a fine dish, served at grand tables, a great fleshy fast-day treat that got round the rules by the simple expedient of having come from the sea. One admires the sheer cheek of it. Even more splendidly, certain other creatures were classed as fish on the flimsiest of watery pretexts, including, by some accounts, the beaver, whose scaly tail and aquatic habits were held to make it fish enough for fast-day eating. The barnacle goose, too, was sometimes eaten on fast days, on the wonderful theory that it was not really a bird at all, but grew from barnacles and was therefore a kind of shellfish. These were marvellous feats of convenient categorization, stretching the definition of fish to breaking point in the service of a better dinner, and they reveal a delightful streak of practical creativity in the medieval approach to the rules. The barnacle goose in particular deserves a moment of gentle wonder, for the reasoning behind it was gloriously, magnificently daft. Nobody in the Middle Ages had seen a barnacle goose lay an egg or build a nest, because the birds bred far away in the distant north, and so a wonderful theory grew up to explain where they came from, that they were not born as ordinary birds at all, but grew, fully formed, from the barnacles that clung to driftwood and the timbers of ships. And if the barnacle goose grew from a barnacle, then surely it was a kind of shellfish, and therefore fish, and therefore perfectly fine to eat on a Friday. It is the sort of argument that could only be believed by someone who very much wanted to eat a goose on a fast day, and it was believed, or at least accepted, for a remarkably long time. One pictures the medieval diner tucking into his roast goose during Lent, entirely untroubled, secure in the knowledge that it was, technically, a shellfish. If the church said fish, then fish it would be, however loosely the term had to be interpreted. There is something genuinely charming in all this, in the image of the medieval diner cheerfully declaring a whale to be a fish so that he might eat it on a Friday, bending the rules with such ingenuity and such a straight face. It reveals a very human streak of practical cunning, a determination to enjoy a decent dinner despite the restrictions, and a willingness to interpret the rules with as much generosity as could possibly be managed. And it gives us some of the strangest fast-day dishes of the whole period, the whale and the porpoise and the barnacle goose, eaten as fish by people who knew perfectly well what they were doing, and simply chose not to mention it. Let that splendid rule-bending settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the everyday sludge that most people actually lived on, the humble medieval pottage. We have spent some time now among the grand feasts and the showpiece dishes, the peacocks and the surprise pies and the prized lampreys, but the honest truth is that most people in the Middle Ages ate none of these things, or only very rarely. For the great majority of medieval folk, the everyday reality of eating was something far humbler, far greyer, and far more monotonous, and it went by the name of pottage. Let us wander gently into the world of the ordinary medieval dinner, and meet the great grey staple that most people lived on. Pottage was the everyday food of the medieval poor, a thick soup or stew that simmered more or less permanently over the fire, made from whatever grains and vegetables and odds and ends were to hand, and eaten day after day after day. It was the great staple of ordinary medieval eating, a sort of endless bubbling porridge of oats or other grains, thickened and bulked out with whatever vegetables the household had, a leek or an onion, some cabbage, some peas or beans, and flavoured, if one was lucky, with a scrap of bacon or a few herbs. This grey and lumpy sludge was what most medieval people ate for most of their meals, the unglamorous foundation of the ordinary diet, filling and nourishing enough but hardly a delight. The great feature of pottage was that it never really stopped, for the pot hung permanently over the fire, and new ingredients were simply added as old ones were eaten, so that the pottage was a kind of ever-changing, ever-continuing stew that went on for days or even weeks. Whatever came to hand went into the pot, and the whole thing simmered on endlessly, its flavour shifting from day to day as new bits were added and old bits cooked down. This meant that the pottage was rarely quite the same twice, and also, one suspects, that the bottom of the pot could get rather elderly and mysterious over time. It was economical and practical, this perpetual pottage, making the most of scarce ingredients, but it must also have been rather monotonous, the same grey sludge, more or less, meal after meal. For flavour and variety, the medieval cook added what herbs and seasonings could be had, and the pottage of a household with a good garden might be quite a savoury and even pleasant thing, green with herbs and thick with vegetables. But for the poorest, the pottage was a thin and joyless affair, watery and grey, with little in it but grain and water and perhaps a few sad vegetables, a meagre and monotonous sustenance that filled the belly without ever really pleasing the palate. This was the daily reality for a great many people, a life lived on thin grey pottage, and it reminds us that the strange grand dishes we have been marvelling at were utterly beyond the experience of most medieval folk, who would have gaped at a roasted peacock as at something from another world. There is something rather humbling in the thought of all that endless pottage, the great grey river of it flowing through medieval life, feeding the many while the few dined on spiced swan and gilded peacock. And we should be honest about the least appetizing feature of the perpetual pot, which is what happened at the very bottom of it. Since fresh ingredients were simply added to the top as the level fell, and the pot was rarely if ever emptied out and scrubbed clean, the oldest food sat at the bottom for a very long time indeed, cooking and re-cooking, day after day, growing steadily more mysterious. What exactly lurked in the depths of a pottage pot that had been going for a fortnight is not a question anyone was terribly keen to investigate, and it is probably kinder to the medieval diner not to dwell on it. But it does rather add to the picture of the humble medieval meal, the thin grey sludge with its ancient and unknowable foundations, ladled out meal after meal from a pot that never truly rested. It reminds us that for most people, in most times, food has been a matter of simple survival rather than delight, a filling of the belly rather than a pleasure of the palate. The humble pottage was not the worst-tasting medieval food, perhaps, but it may have been the most wearily monotonous, the same grey sludge day after day for a whole life long, and it gives us a proper sense of the ordinary medieval table, far from the grand feast, where the real business of eating was simply not going hungry. Let that grey and humble pottage settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the medieval bread that could break a tooth. Bread was the great foundation of the medieval diet, the staff of life, eaten by everyone at every meal, high and low alike. But medieval bread was a rather different thing from the soft and pillowy loaves we know today, and some of it was genuinely alarming, gritty and hard and dark and capable, on a bad day, of doing real damage to the teeth. Let us wander gently into the medieval bakery and see what we find, keeping our jaws well clear. The bread that the wealthy ate was fine white bread, made from well-sifted wheat flour, soft and pale and pleasant, more or less what we would recognize as good bread today. But this fine white bread was a luxury, and the further down the social scale one went, the darker, coarser, and grittier the bread became, until at the very bottom it was a dense, heavy, dark loaf made from whatever grains could be had, mixed together and coarsely ground. This coarse dark bread, the bread of the poor, was a very different thing from the fine white loaf of the wealthy, heavy and dense and hard to chew, though it was also, we should say in fairness, probably rather more nourishing than the refined white bread of the rich. The real trouble with medieval bread was the grit, for the grain was ground between great stones, and tiny fragments of stone inevitably found their way into the flour, so that medieval bread very often contained a fine scattering of grit that wore down the teeth over time. The teeth of medieval people show the effects of this, worn down by years of eating gritty, stone-flecked bread, ground away by the constant abrasion of all that grit. Every loaf carried its little cargo of stone dust, and every meal wore the teeth a little further, so that the medieval diner's smile grew steadily flatter over a lifetime of gritty bread. It was an unavoidable hazard of the medieval table, this grit, and a genuinely unpleasant one, quite apart from the occasional larger fragment that might crack a tooth outright. At the very bottom of the bread hierarchy was a loaf so coarse and grim that it was barely distinguished from animal feed, a dark, dense, bran-heavy bread made from the cheapest and coarsest grains, sometimes including beans and peas ground up together. This horse bread, as it was sometimes called, for it was also fed to horses, was the bread of the very poorest and of the hardest times, a heavy, dark, joyless loaf, eaten when nothing better was to be had. In times of famine, the bread might be eked out with even stranger ingredients, ground acorns or bark or worse, anything to make the precious grain go further. This was bread at its most desperate, a grim and gritty sustenance that kept people alive without ever pretending to be a pleasure. Even the fine white bread of the wealthy served a further and rather surprising purpose. For at the grand table, thick slices of day-old bread were used as plates, soaking up the juices of the food piled upon them. These bread plates, or trenchers, were eaten at the end of the meal, or given to the poor, or thrown to the dogs, a practical and edible form of tableware that reminds us how differently the medieval table was arranged. So bread was not only food, but also plate, foundation and vessel both, the great edible bedrock of the medieval meal. And whether it was the fine white loaf of the rich or the gritty dark horse bread of the poor, it carried its little burden of grit, wearing away the teeth of prince and pauper alike. Let that gritty, tooth-cracking bread settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a strange white liquid that the medieval cook poured over absolutely everything. If you were to spend any time at all in a medieval kitchen, one ingredient would strike you as turning up absolutely everywhere, poured into and over an astonishing range of dishes with a frequency that borders on obsession. That ingredient was almond milk, the ground-up, watered-down essence of almonds, and the medieval cook simply could not get enough of it. Let us wander gently into the strange ubiquity of medieval almond milk. Almond milk was made by grinding almonds and mixing them with water to produce a smooth white liquid, and the medieval cook used it in enormous quantities, in a truly staggering range of dishes, sweet and savoury alike. It appeared in sauces and soups, in pottages and puddings, poured over fish and mixed into all manner of things, a great white flood of it running through the whole of medieval cookery. Recipe after recipe called for almond milk, sometimes in large amounts, so that a well-stocked medieval kitchen must have got through a tremendous quantity of almonds, all ground up and mixed with water to feed the cook's endless appetite for the stuff. There was a very good reason for this great enthusiasm, and it brings us back to those endless fast days. For on the many days when dairy products, like meat, were forbidden, almond milk provided a substitute for the milk and cream that could not be used. Where a dish would normally call for milk or cream, the fast-day cook reached for almond milk instead, a plant-based substitute that got round the religious rules while providing a similar richness and smoothness. Since there were so very many fast days, the cook needed a great deal of almond milk, and it became a staple of the medieval kitchen, the great fast-day stand-in for the forbidden dairy. This is a rather clever bit of medieval problem-solving, and almond milk was genuinely useful, allowing all sorts of rich dishes to be made on days when dairy was off the menu. Almond milk had the further advantage that it kept far better than real milk, which spoiled quickly in a world without refrigeration, so that the cook could make almond milk fresh whenever it was needed from a store of dried almonds. This made it a practical and reliable ingredient, always available, never spoiling, a dependable staple in a way that real milk could never be. So there were sound, practical reasons for the medieval cook's love of almond milk, and it was, in truth, one of the more sensible and successful features of the medieval kitchen, a genuinely useful ingredient put to good use. We can hardly count it among the worst of medieval foods, for almond milk is perfectly pleasant, and indeed has become rather fashionable again in our own day. Still, there is something rather comic in the sheer ubiquity of the stuff, in the image of the medieval cook reaching for the almond milk yet again, pouring it into yet another dish, as though it were the answer to every culinary question. It turns up so relentlessly in the old recipes that one begins to suspect the medieval cook simply liked it, and used it whether it was needed or not, out of sheer force of habit. And it reminds us that the medieval kitchen, for all its strangeness, was also a place of real ingenuity, finding clever solutions to the challenges of its world, even if those solutions did involve drowning absolutely everything in a great white flood of ground-up almonds. Let that ubiquitous almond milk settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the medieval love of sharp and sour flavors. Alongside their obsession with spice and their fondness for sweetness, the medieval cook had a third great flavor enthusiasm that would strike us as rather odd, a real love of sharp and sour tastes, achieved through the liberal use of some distinctly puckering ingredients. For the medieval dish was very often not just spiced and sweetened but soured as well, given a sharp acidic tang that we might find rather startling. Let us wander gently into the puckering world of medieval sourness. The great souring ingredient of the medieval kitchen was verjuice, a sharp, sour liquid made from the juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, and the cook used it lavishly to give his dishes a sharp, acidic edge. Verjuice was poured into sauces and over dishes with great enthusiasm, its sour, puckering tang, a defining flavor of medieval cookery, as characteristic of the medieval table as all that spice. It gave the food a sharpness that we might find excessive, a real acidic bite that cut through the richness of the heavily spiced and sweetened dishes. To the medieval palate, this sharpness was clearly a pleasure, a desirable counterpoint to the sweetness and the spice. But to us it might seem rather aggressive, a mouth-puckering sourness laid on with a heavy hand. Vinegar, too, was used liberally, another source of sharp acidity that the medieval cook splashed about with abandon, souring his dishes and cutting through their richness. Between the verjuice and the vinegar, the medieval dish was often given a really pronounced sourness, a sharp acidic edge that combined with the sweetness and the spice to produce those complex, clashing, many-flavored dishes that so characterized the medieval table. Sweet and sour and spiced and rich, all at once, all fighting for attention. The medieval dish was a riot of strong flavors, and the sourness was a key part of the assault. It was a cuisine of extremes, piling flavor upon flavor, with no restraint at all. The combination of all these strong flavors at once, the sweet and the sour and the heavily spiced, is perhaps the single thing that would most bewilder a modern diner faced with a grand medieval dish. We tend to prefer our flavors cleaner and simpler, one or two tastes working together in harmony, and the medieval habit of throwing everything into the pot at once, sweetness and sourness, and a whole cupboard of spice, would strike us as a confusing muddle. The medieval palate clearly delighted in this complexity, in the clash and combination of many strong flavors, but it is a taste we have largely lost, and the results would seem to us overwrought and bewildering, too much of too many things all at once. Yet there is a certain logic to it, for these strong flavors, the spice and the sweetness and the sourness, all worked to enliven food that might otherwise have been rather dull, to bring interest and excitement to the medieval table. In a world of limited ingredients and long winters, of preserved meats and monotonous staples, the lively play of strong flavors was a way of making food interesting, of turning a dull dish into something exciting. So the medieval love of the sharp and the sour, like the love of spice and sweetness, was in its way a search for flavor and interest, even if the results would strike us as excessive. And it adds one more note to our picture of the strange medieval dish. sharp and sour as well as sweet and spiced. A puckering, clashing, overwhelming mouthful quite unlike anything we would make today. Let that sharp and sour tang settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the most spectacular and ridiculous creations of the medieval kitchen, the grand subtleties. We come now to the very peak of medieval culinary showing off, the most elaborate, most spectacular, and most gloriously pointless creations of the whole grand kitchen, the dishes known as subtleties. For at the greatest feasts, the medieval cook did not merely prepare food, he created edible works of art, great sculptures made of sugar and pastry and marzipan, designed to astonish the guests and display the boundless wealth and creativity of the host. Let us marvel gently at these splendid, ridiculous confections. A subtlety was an elaborate edible sculpture, often made largely of sugar and almond paste, moulded and painted and gilded into the most extraordinary shapes and scenes, and presented between the courses of a grand feast. These were not really meant to be eaten so much as admired, great confectionery centerpieces that might depict castles or ships or beasts or entire scenes, complete with figures and buildings and elaborate detail, all wrought in sugar and pastry. The cook and the confectioner lavished tremendous skill and effort on these creations, producing edible artworks of real intricacy and ambition, designed to draw gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. The subtlety was the ultimate expression of the medieval feast. As spectacle, food transformed into pure display. The grandest subtleties were astonishingly elaborate, whole scenes and stories rendered in sugar, sometimes carrying political messages or flattering the guest of honor, sometimes simply showing off the wealth and artistry of the host. A great feast might feature several subtleties, one between each course, each more elaborate than the last, building to a climax of confectionery magnificence. These were the showstoppers of the medieval feast, the moments of greatest spectacle, when a great sugar sculpture was carried in to the amazement of all. That so much skill and expense should be lavished on something barely meant to be eaten tells us everything about the medieval feast as a display of wealth and power, in which the actual food was often the least of it. The word subtlety, which seems an odd name for such a grand and showy thing, refers to the cleverness and ingenuity of the creation, the subtle skill involved in producing such elaborate edible art. And clever they certainly were, these confections, feats of real craftsmanship that pushed the art of the kitchen to its limits, producing sculptures of sugar that could rival the work of any artist. The confectioners who made them were highly skilled craftsmen, masters of their difficult art, and the best subtleties were genuinely astonishing creations, marvels of skill and ingenuity that deserved the admiration they received. There was nothing crude about these sugar sculptures. They were the height of the confectioner's art, elaborate and refined, and tremendously impressive. For all their magnificence, though, the subtleties belong on our list of medieval culinary strangenesses, for they represent food that had almost entirely left behind the business of nourishment and become pure spectacle, sugar sculptures barely meant to be eaten at all. There is something rather wonderful and rather absurd in the whole enterprise, in the lavishing of such skill and expense on a great sugar castle that would be admired for a moment and then perhaps broken up and eaten or simply cleared away. It is the medieval feast at its most extravagant and its most theatrical, food as art and spectacle and display, and it reminds us once more that the grand medieval meal was above all a performance. Let that spectacular sugar sculpture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to one of the most bizarre of all medieval dishes, the creature that was two animals sewn into one. Of all the strange and theatrical dishes that emerged from the medieval kitchen, few are as gloriously, bafflingly bizarre as the cockentrice, a dish that involved taking two different animals, cutting them in half, and sewing the front of one to the back of the other to create a single impossible creature. It is a dish so strange, so ambitious, and so thoroughly peculiar that it deserves a gentle chapter all to itself. Let us wander, with a bemused smile, into the strange business of the cockatrice. The cockatrice was made by taking a pig and a large bird, most often a capon, cutting each of them in half, and then stitching the front half of one to the back half of the other, producing a single monstrous creature that was half pig and half fowl. The two halves were sewn together, stuffed and roasted, and the result was a bizarre hybrid beast that had never existed in nature, a culinary chimera brought to life on the feast day table. Sometimes the halves were arranged one way, sometimes the other, so that one might have the front of a pig and the back of a capon, or the front of a capon and the back of a pig. But either way, the result was a strange, stitched-together monster, a joke and a marvel, and a genuine feat of kitchencraft all at once. The purpose of this peculiar creation was, once again, spectacle and entertainment, the delight of presenting the guests with an impossible creature, a beast from no natural order, cooked and served and ready to eat. The medieval feast, as we have seen again and again, loved a good spectacle, loved to astonish and amuse its guests, and a roasted creature that was half pig and half bird was certainly astonishing and amusing. It was a piece of culinary theatre, a joke made of meat, a way of showing off the cook's skill and giving the guests something to marvel at and talk about. The cockatrice was food as entertainment, as clever trickery, as a source of wonder and laughter at the feast. The cockatrice also reflects the medieval cook's genuine delight in transformation and disguise, in making food into something other than what it was, in surprising and deceiving the eye. This was a real theme of grand medieval cooking, the love of dishes that were not what they seemed, that transformed one thing into another, that played tricks on the diner's expectations. The cockatrice, the impossible stitched-together beast, was the perfect expression of this delight, a creature that could not exist made real on the table, a triumph of culinary trickery and transformation. It reveals a playful, inventive, theatrical streak in the medieval kitchen, a love of surprise and illusion that produced some of its very strangest creations. We may well wonder how the cockatrice actually tasted, this strange hybrid of pig and fowl, and the honest answer is probably not especially wonderful, for the joining of two such different meats, cooked together, cannot have made for a particularly harmonious dish. And the cockatrice was only the beginning of the medieval cook's appetite for stitched-together and disguised creations, for this was a kitchen that genuinely loved to deceive the eye. Cooks would fashion fake eggs, mould-coloured pastes into the shapes of animals and fruits that were nothing of the sort, make one meat masquerade as another, and generally delight in serving up food that was not what it appeared to be. A dish might arrive looking like one thing and turn out, to gasps around the table, to be quite another. It was all part of the same theatrical spirit, the same love of surprise and illusion and clever trickery that ran through the whole of grand medieval cooking. The medieval feast wanted to astonish its guests, and a plate of food that was secretly something else entirely did the job splendidly. But the taste, as with so many of these grand feast dishes, was never really the point. The point was the spectacle, the joke, the marvel of the impossible creature on the table. And so the cockatrice takes its place among the strangest of medieval dishes, a monstrous, marvellous, thoroughly bizarre creation that shows the medieval kitchen at its most playful and inventive, sewing animals together for the sheer theatrical fun of it. Let that stitched-together marvel settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the smallest creatures that found their way onto the medieval plate, the tiny birds eaten whole. We have marvelled at the great birds of the medieval feast, the peacock in its feathers and the grand roasted fowl. But at the other end of the scale, the medieval diner also ate birds of a very different kind. Tiny songbirds, larks and sparrows and finches and the like, eaten whole, bones and all, in a single crunchy mouthful. It is a practice that would rather startle us today, and it belongs firmly among the odder features of the medieval table. Let us wander gently into the business of the little birds. The medieval diner ate a great variety of small birds that we would never dream of eating today. The tiny songbirds of hedge and field, caught in nets and traps and cooked up as a delicacy. Larks in particular were considered a treat, along with sparrows, finches, thrushes, blackbirds, and all manner of little birds, roasted or baked into pies and eaten in quantity. These were not substantial birds with proper cuts of meat, but tiny morsels, a few mouthfuls at most, and they were eaten more or less whole, the little bones crunched up along with the flesh. To the medieval diner, a plate of roasted larks was a real pleasure, a delicate and tasty dish, however alarming it might seem to us. The eating of these tiny birds whole, bones and all, is the part that would most startle a modern diner, for we are used to carefully avoiding bones, and the idea of crunching up a whole small bird, skeleton included, is rather alarming. But the bones of these little birds were small and soft enough to eat, and the medieval diner thought nothing of consuming the whole creature in a few crunchy bites, bones and flesh together. Larks in particular were often eaten this way. The whole tiny bird popped into the mouth and crunched up, a practice that continued in some places for centuries, and that strikes us today as decidedly odd. There is something both delicate and slightly gruesome about it, the eating of these whole little birds, a refined delicacy that also involves crunching up a skeleton. These little birds were caught in great numbers, for a substantial dish required a great many of them, each bird providing only a few mouthfuls, so that a plate of small birds represented quite a slaughter of the hedgerows. Vast numbers of songbirds were taken for the table, netted and trapped and snared, to satisfy the medieval appetite for these tiny delicacies. We might feel a little uneasy about this today, when many of these birds are cherished and protected. But to the medieval diner, they were simply food, a seasonal delicacy to be caught and eaten like anything else. The hedgerows were a larder, and the little birds within them were fair game, caught in their multitudes for the medieval table. The medieval taste for tiny birds eaten whole reveals once again how much more robust and less squeamish the medieval appetite was than our own. How the medieval diner would happily eat things that we would find alarming and relish them as delicacies. A plate of whole roasted larks, bones and all, was a refined pleasure to the medieval gourmet, a delicate treat to be savoured, however much it might make us wince. And it adds another item to our collection of medieval culinary strangenesses, the little birds crunched up whole, a delicacy of the medieval table that we would very firmly leave to the hedgerows today. Let that crunchy little delicacy settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the grandest birds of all, the swans and herons of the noble feast. At the very grandest medieval feasts, the birds on the table grew grander still, and the diner might be presented with creatures that we would never think to eat at all, the great and stately birds of river and field, roasted and served up as the height of noble dining. For the medieval feast delighted in grand and impressive birds, the bigger and more spectacular the better, and some of them make for very strange eating indeed by modern standards. Let us wander gently among the swans and herons of the noble table. The swan was among the grandest of all medieval feast birds, a great stately creature reserved for the tables of the wealthy and the noble, roasted and served up with tremendous ceremony as a showpiece of the grandest feasts. The swan was a bird of real prestige, its consumption a mark of high status, and a roasted swan was a magnificent sight, a great bird presented in splendour at the noble table. The trouble, as with so many of these grand birds, was that the swan is not actually very nice to eat, its flesh being tough, dark and rather greasy, more impressive to look at than to taste. But the swan was eaten for its grandeur and its status, not for its flavour, and a roasted swan continued to grace the noblest tables despite being, by most accounts, a rather disappointing dinner. The heron, too, along with other great long-legged birds like the crane and the bittern, was esteemed at the grand medieval feast, these tall and stately birds being caught and roasted and served up as prestigious dishes. Herons and cranes were birds of the grand table, their consumption a mark of status, and their presentation a matter of ceremony, however strange it might seem to us to eat such creatures. And once again, these grand birds were not especially delicious, their flesh being tough and fishy and none too pleasant, so that they too were eaten more for their prestige than for their taste. The medieval noble diner would sooner eat an impressive bird that tasted nasty than a humble one that tasted nice, so long as the impressive bird enhanced his status and grandeur. This preference for grand and impressive birds, whatever their actual flavour, tells us a great deal about the values of the medieval feast, in which status and spectacle counted for far more than mere deliciousness. The birds that graced the noble table were chosen for their grandeur, their rarity, their prestige, and their impressive appearance, not for how they tasted, so that the medieval noble often dined on tough, greasy, fishy birds that were magnificent to behold and disappointing to eat. It was a cuisine of display, in which the important thing was to be seen eating grand and prestigious foods, however unpleasant they might actually be. The swan and the heron were status symbols first, and dinner second, and their flavour was very much a secondary consideration. There is a certain absurdity in all this, in the image of the medieval noble proudly consuming a tough and greasy swan simply because it was grand and prestigious, when a humble chicken would have tasted far better. It reveals the peculiar priorities of the medieval feast, the triumph of status over flavour, of spectacle over substance, that runs through so much of the grand medieval table. And it adds the swan and the heron and the crane to our collection of medieval dishes that were more impressive than enjoyable. Grand birds eaten for their glory rather than their taste. Another instance of the medieval preference for the magnificent over the merely delicious. Let that grand and greasy bird settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the wobbling, quivering world of medieval jellies. The medieval kitchen had a great fondness for jelly, for dishes set firm and quivering with the setting power boiled out of animal bones and skin. And these wobbling creations turned up in forms both sweet and savoury that would strike us as decidedly strange. For while we know jelly as a sweet and wobbly treat, the medieval jelly was a far broader and stranger thing, encompassing all manner of savoury and meaty creations that we would find rather off-putting. Let us wander gently into the quivering world of medieval jelly. The medieval cook made jelly by boiling down animal bones, skin, and feet to extract their natural setting power, producing a liquid that would set firm as it cooled. And this technique was used for a great range of dishes, savoury as well as sweet. Meat and fish were set into savoury jellies, suspended in the quivering, translucent stuff, producing dishes of jellied flesh that we would find rather alarming. A jellied fish, or a piece of meat set in a savoury aspic, was a normal part of the medieval table, the food preserved and presented in its wobbling, transparent casing. To us, the idea of meat or fish suspended in jelly is decidedly unappealing, but to the medieval diner, it was a normal and even elegant way to serve food. These savoury jellies served a practical purpose as well as an aesthetic one, for the jelly helped to preserve the food within it, sealing it from the air and keeping it edible for longer, a useful function in a world without refrigeration. So the jellying of meat and fish was not merely a matter of taste but of preservation, a way of keeping food that would otherwise spoil, and this practical value helped to make jelly such a common feature of the medieval table. But it also produced dishes that we would find strange and off-putting, wobbling masses of jellied flesh, meat and fish suspended in quivering transparent aspic, a form of food presentation that has largely and mercifully fallen out of fashion. The medieval jelly was also often coloured and decorated, tinted in bright hues and arranged in elaborate patterns, for the medieval cook loved a colourful and decorative dish, and jelly lent itself well to such treatment. A grand medieval jelly might be brightly coloured, divided into sections of different hues, or decorated with patterns and designs, a quivering, colourful centrepiece that combined the medieval loves of jelly and of bright colour. These decorative jellies were another form of edible display, wobbling and colourful and elaborate, designed to impress the eye as much as to please the palate. The medieval diner clearly delighted in these creations, however strange they might seem to us, in the quivering, colourful, elaborate jellies that graced the grand table. The medieval fondness for jelly, and especially for savoury and meaty jellies, is another of those tastes that we have largely lost. Another instance of the great gulf between the medieval palate and our own. We keep our jelly sweet and simple, a treat for children, and the idea of a savoury jellied fish or a wobbling meat aspic strikes us as thoroughly unappetizing. But to the medieval diner, these were normal and even elegant dishes, useful for preservation and pleasing to the eye, a valued part of the medieval table. And so the wobbling, quivering jellies take their place among the strange foods of the Middle Ages, meat and fish suspended in aspic, brightly coloured and elaborately decorated, a taste that has thankfully wobbled its way out of our own kitchens. Let that quivering jelly settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the medieval love of colouring food in alarming hues. The medieval cook had a great love of colour, of food dyed in bright and startling hues, and even of food covered in actual gold, and the results could be very strange indeed. A table set with dishes in colours that no food has any business being. For the medieval diner did not want his food to look natural. He wanted it to look spectacular, and that often meant dyeing it in the most alarming shades. Let us wander gently into the garish, gilded world of medieval food colour. The medieval cook dyed his food in a great range of bright colours, using various natural dyes to turn dishes green and red and yellow and blue, producing a table full of startlingly coloured food. A dish might be dyed a vivid green with herbs, or a deep red or yellow with various colourings, or even a strange blue, transforming ordinary food into something bright and eye-catching and thoroughly unnatural looking. The medieval diner clearly delighted in these bright colours, in food that looked vivid and spectacular, however strange the effect might seem to us. We prefer our food to look more or less like itself, but the medieval cook wanted his to look dyed and decorated, bright and artificial and impressive. The grandest and most extravagant colouring of all was the use of actual gold, for at the very finest tables, food was decorated with gold leaf, real gold beaten into sheets so thin that it could be laid over dishes to make them gleam. This gilding of food was the ultimate extravagance, the eating of actual gold, a display of wealth so lavish and so pointless that it takes the breath away. A gilded dish gleamed and shimmered with real gold, a spectacular and absurdly expensive creation that announced the host's wealth in the most direct way imaginable, by literally covering the food in money. That anyone should eat gold, which has no taste and no nourishment, and passes straight through the body, tells us everything about the medieval feast as a display of wealth, in which spectacle and status counted for everything. The colouring and gilding of food served no purpose of flavour or nourishment whatever, being purely a matter of display, of making the food look spectacular and expensive and impressive. This was food as pure spectacle, dyed and gilded and decorated to astonish the eye, with no thought at all for how it might taste. The bright colours and the gleaming gold added nothing to the flavour of the food, and the strange dyes may sometimes have added rather unpleasant tastes of their own. But that was beside the point. The point was the show, the spectacle, the display of wealth and artistry. The medieval cook coloured and gilded his food to impress, and impress it surely did, however strange and garish the results. This love of bright colour and gleaming gold is yet another expression of the great medieval theme we have met again and again. The feast as spectacle, food as display, the triumph of appearance over flavour. The medieval diner wanted his grand food to look astonishing, to gleam and glow and dazzle the eye, And if that meant dyeing it in alarming colours or covering it in gold, then so be it. That the food might taste strange, or that the gold added nothing but expense, was of no consequence beside the glory of the spectacle. And so the garish, gilded, brightly coloured dishes of the medieval feast take their place in our collection, food dyed and gold-plated for pure show, another instance of the medieval preference for the spectacular over the simply good. Let that garish, gleaming spectacle settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the medieval sweet tooth and the strange world of medieval sweets. The medieval diner, at least among those who could afford it, had a tremendous sweet tooth, a great love of sugar and sweetness that expressed itself in all manner of sweet creations, some familiar and some decidedly strange. For sugar, when it could be had, was a precious and delightful luxury, and the medieval cook used it lavishly to produce a range of sweets and confections that reveal yet another side of the strange medieval table. Let us wander gently into the sweet and sugary world of medieval treats. Sugar was a rare and expensive luxury in much of the Middle Ages, imported from distant lands at great cost, and it was treated accordingly, as a precious substance to be used lavishly by those who could afford it and to be admired as a mark of wealth and refinement. Because it was so expensive, sugar was a display of status, and the sweet dishes it produced were luxuries of the wealthy table, confections that announced the host's ability to afford such precious stuff. The medieval sweet tooth, then, was in part a matter of showing off, of displaying one's wealth through the lavish use of expensive sugar, as well as a genuine delight in sweetness. The wealthy medieval diner loved his sweets both for their taste and for what they represented. Among the sweet creations of the medieval kitchen was marchpane, an early form of what we would call marzipan, a paste of ground almonds and sugar that could be moulded and shaped and coloured into all manner of forms. Marchpane was a great favourite, used to make sweet sculptures and decorations, moulded into shapes and figures, a sweet and pliable confection that the medieval cook delighted in working. Wafers, too, thin, crisp biscuits cooked between hot irons, were a popular sweet treat, along with various other confections and sweetmeats that satisfied the medieval craving for sweetness. These sweets were the delight of the wealthy table, precious and luxurious treats that made the most of costly sugar. One of the stranger features of the medieval attitude to sugar was that it was regarded not merely as a food but as a medicine, believed to have real health-giving properties and prescribed for various ailments. The medieval physician might recommend sugar as a remedy, and sweet confections were sometimes eaten as much for their supposed health benefits as for their pleasure, a happy arrangement that allowed the medieval diner to enjoy his sweets with a clear conscience. This idea of sugar as medicine seems strange to us, who know sugar to be rather the opposite of health-giving. But to the medieval mind, sugar was a precious and beneficial substance, good for the body as well as pleasing to the palate. It was a wonderfully convenient belief, allowing sweetness to be enjoyed as a form of medicine. The medieval sweet tooth and the strange world of medieval sweets reveals a gentler and more familiar side of the medieval table. For here at least we can recognize something of our own tastes, our own love of sweetness and sugar and confection. The medieval diner's delight in marchpane and wafers and sweet treats is a delight we can share, however strange some of the details, and it reminds us that the medieval table was not all grim fish and jellied flesh, but also held real sweetness and pleasure. Yet even here there was strangeness, in the sugar sculptures and the sugar as medicine, and the lavish display of precious sweetness. And so the medieval sweet tooth takes its place in our wander through the strange medieval table, a sweeter and more familiar corner of that very strange world. Let that sweet indulgence settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange things the medieval diner drank. Having explored so much of what the medieval diner ate, we should spare a little time for what he drank, for the medieval cup held some strange things too, spiced and sweetened and mixed in ways that would surprise us as much as the food. For the medieval diner did not simply drink his ale and wine plain, but often dressed them up with spices and sweeteners and all manner of additions, producing some strange concoctions indeed. Let us wander gently into the medieval cup. Ale was the everyday drink of the Middle Ages, drunk by everyone in great quantities. But medieval ale was a rather different thing from the beer we know, for it was made without hops, which had not yet come into general use, and so it was sweeter, heavier, and more quickly spoiled than modern beer. This unhopped ale did not keep well and had to be drunk fresh, often within days of brewing, and it varied greatly in quality, from good fresh ale to sour and spoiled stuff barely fit to drink. The medieval diner drank a great deal of this ale, for it was safer than water and a staple of the diet, but much of it must have been rather nasty, thick and sweet, and sometimes on the turn, a far cry from the clean, crisp beer of today. Wine, for those who could afford it, was the finer drink, but medieval wine also had its problems, for it did not keep well and often turned sour, and much of the wine the medieval diner drank was rough, thin, and none too pleasant. To improve poor wine, and to make a luxurious drink of good wine, the medieval diner often spiced and sweetened it, producing spiced wines that were a great favourite at the grand table. These spiced, sweetened wines, warmed and flavoured with the same lavish hand that spiced the food, were a popular medieval drink, rich and strong and heavily seasoned, a liquid version of the medieval love of spice. To us they might seem rather cloying and overwhelming, but to the medieval diner they were a great treat, a warming and luxurious drink for a cold evening. The medieval diner also enjoyed a range of other strange drinks, sweetened and spiced concoctions of various kinds, including drinks thickened with eggs or enriched with cream and ale, in combinations we would find rather alarming. There were possets, curdled drinks of hot milk and ale or wine, and caudles, warm thickened drinks often given to invalids, and various other rich and strange concoctions that the medieval diner enjoyed. These thick, warm, curdled, spiced drinks would strike us as decidedly odd, more like a strange soup than a drink, but the medieval diner valued them as warming, nourishing, and comforting, especially in sickness or cold weather. They belong among the stranger items of medieval consumption, these curdled and thickened drinks, another instance of medieval tastes quite unlike our own. The medieval cup, then, held its own share of strangeness. From the sweet unhopped ale that spoiled in days, to the heavily spiced wines and the curdled, thickened possets, a range of drinks that would surprise the modern drinker as much as the food surprises the modern eater. The medieval diner drank as he ate, with a love of spice and sweetness and strong flavours, and a robustness that could stomach sour ale and turned wine without complaint. And so the strange medieval drinks take their place alongside the strange medieval foods, completing our picture of a table quite unlike our own, where even the cup held surprises. Let that strange medieval drink settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the alarming conditions of the medieval kitchen itself. Having wandered through so many strange medieval dishes, we might pause to consider the place where they were all made, the medieval kitchen itself, which was, by our standards, a rather alarming environment, and which does much to explain why medieval food might not have been entirely wholesome. For the conditions in which medieval food was prepared would give a modern health inspector a fit of the vapours, and they are worth a gentle glance as we consider the worst of medieval eating. Let us peer, carefully, into the smoky old kitchen. The medieval kitchen was a smoky, dirty, and rather chaotic place, lit by fire and lacking any of the hygiene we take for granted, a challenging environment in which to produce clean and wholesome food. Cooking was done over open fires and in great hearths, filling the kitchen with smoke and soot, and the general cleanliness of the place fell far short of modern standards. There was no refrigeration to keep food fresh, no clean running water, no understanding of the germs that cause food to spoil and sicken, and the medieval cook worked in conditions that we would consider decidedly unsanitary. Food was prepared on surfaces and with implements that were far from clean, in a kitchen full of smoke and dirt, and the results, however carefully cooked, cannot always have been entirely wholesome. The lack of refrigeration was a particular problem, for in a world without any way to keep food cold, meat and fish and other perishables spoiled quickly, and the medieval cook was in a constant battle against the spoiling of his ingredients. Food had to be used quickly or preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, and even then it might turn before it could be eaten, so that the medieval diner not infrequently ate food that was somewhat past its best. We have already dismissed the old notion that spices were used to disguise rotten meat, but it remains true that food spoiled more readily in the medieval kitchen, and that the medieval diner had a more robust tolerance for slightly turned food than we would. The constant struggle against spoilage was a defining feature of medieval cooking, and one that cannot always have been won. The medieval understanding of what made food safe or unsafe was, moreover, quite limited, for the germs and bacteria that cause food to spoil and sicken were entirely unknown, and the medieval cook had no real understanding of why food went bad or how to keep it safe. Food safety, in the modern sense, simply did not exist, and the medieval diner ate at a rather greater risk than we do, exposed to spoiled food and unclean preparation, without any of the knowledge or techniques that keep us safe today. This is not to say that medieval food was constantly making people ill, for the medieval cook had his practical wisdom and his methods of preservation, but the risks were real, and the conditions were far from safe by our standards. All of this, the smoke and the dirt, the lack of refrigeration, the limited understanding of food safety, meant that the medieval kitchen was a rather alarming place by modern standards, and that medieval food, however carefully prepared, was not always as clean and wholesome as we would like. It adds a further dimension to our picture of the worst of medieval eating, for beyond the strange flavours and the alarming ingredients, there was also the simple matter of food prepared in less than hygienic conditions, sometimes past its best, without the safety we take for granted. So we might spare a further moment of gratitude for our clean modern kitchens, our refrigerators, and our understanding of hygiene, as we contemplate the smoky, dirty, alarming kitchen of the Middle Ages. Let that smoky old kitchen settle gently in the dark. We turn now to consider what the ordinary poor actually ate, far from the grand feast. We have spent much of our time tonight among the grand feasts and their spectacular dishes, the peacocks and subtleties and gilded creations, but it is worth remembering, as we near the end of our wander, that all of this was utterly beyond the experience of most medieval people, for the great majority lived far from such splendour, and their food was a humble and monotonous affair that we have touched on but should consider properly. Let us wander gently into the real, everyday diet of the medieval poor. The ordinary medieval peasant lived on a simple and limited diet, centred on bread, pottage and ale, with vegetables from the garden, a little cheese, and only rarely any meat. This was the foundation of the ordinary diet, the humble fare that sustained the great majority of medieval people: coarse dark bread, thick grey pottage, weak ale, and whatever vegetables and dairy could be produced at home. Meat was a rare luxury for the poor, eaten only occasionally, and the everyday diet was largely without it, a monotonous round of bread and pottage and vegetables that provided sustenance without much variety or pleasure. This was the real medieval diet, for most people, most of the time, far removed from the grand dishes we have marvelled at. The food of the poor was monotonous above all, the same limited range of humble foods eaten day after day, season after season, with little variety and few treats. The peasant ate his bread and his pottage and his vegetables in an endless repetitive round, the same grey fare appearing at meal after meal, brightened only occasionally by a scrap of meat or a rare treat. This monotony was perhaps the hardest thing about the diet of the poor. Not that it was disgusting exactly, but that it was so relentlessly, wearily the same, a lifetime of bread and pottage with little to break the sameness. We who enjoy such endless variety in our food can scarcely imagine the monotony of the medieval peasant's diet, the same humble fare repeated without end. The diet of the poor was also, in hard times, simply insufficient, for medieval life was precarious, harvests failed, and famine was a real and recurring threat, so that the poor often went hungry and sometimes starved. In good years, the humble diet was enough to sustain life, if not to delight the palate, but in bad years it might fail entirely, and the poor faced hunger and want, and even starvation. This is the grimmest truth of medieval food, that for many people the great problem was not the strangeness or the monotony of the diet, but simply getting enough of it at all, in a world where hunger was never far away. The worst tasting medieval food, for the poor, was often no food at all, the empty belly of the hungry year. Remembering the diet of the poor gives us a proper perspective on all the strange grand dishes we have explored, reminding us that they were the food of a tiny wealthy minority, utterly beyond the experience of the ordinary medieval person. While the great feasted on peacocks and subtleties, the many lived on bread and pottage, and often went hungry, and this contrast is worth holding in mind as we contemplate the medieval table. The strange and spectacular dishes were real, but they were the food of the few, and the real medieval diet, for most people, was a humble and monotonous and sometimes insufficient affair. Let that humble reality settle gently in the dark. We turn now, in fairness, to consider some things the medieval cook actually got right. Having spent so long tonight poking gentle fun at the strange and alarming and off-putting foods of the Middle Ages, it is only fair that we pause now to acknowledge that the medieval cook was not simply a purveyor of grim and revolting dishes, and that medieval food, for all its strangeness, had its real successes and genuine pleasures. For it would be unkind and untrue to leave you thinking that everything the medieval diner ate was nasty. Let us wander gently through a few of the things the medieval kitchen genuinely got right. The medieval cook was, in many respects, genuinely skilled, a master of real techniques and knowledge, capable of producing dishes of real quality and refinement. The great cooks of the grand medieval kitchens were craftsmen of real accomplishment, skilled in the arts of their trade, and much of what they produced, beneath all the spice and spectacle, was genuinely well made. The techniques of medieval cookery, the roasting and baking and sauce-making, were often sophisticated and effective, and the best medieval food was the product of real skill and care. We should not imagine the medieval cook as a bungler, for many were true masters of their craft, producing food of real quality by the standards of their day. Many medieval dishes, moreover, were genuinely pleasant, even by our standards, for beneath the strange and spectacular creations there was a great deal of sound, tasty, wholesome food. The medieval cook made good hearty stews and pies, flavorful roasts, tasty sauces, and all manner of genuinely enjoyable dishes that we would happily eat today. The heavily spiced grand dishes and the alarming showpieces were only part of the medieval table, and much of the everyday cooking, when done well, was perfectly good food, tasty and satisfying and pleasant. We have focused tonight on the strange and the off-putting, but we should remember that these were the exceptions, and that much medieval food was simply good. The medieval cook also had real wisdom about ingredients and flavors, a deep practical knowledge of how to make the most of what was available, how to preserve and prepare and season food that we might learn from even today. The medieval kitchen made clever use of herbs and seasonings, understood the preserving of food, and had a real practical wisdom about cookery that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge. Some medieval techniques and combinations have been rediscovered and admired in our own day, and there is genuine skill and wisdom in the old cookery, for all its strangeness. The medieval cook knew a great deal about his craft. and much of that knowledge was sound and valuable. So we should not be too unkind to the medieval cook, who worked with real skill under difficult conditions and produced much genuinely good food alongside the strange and spectacular creations we have marveled at. The worst of medieval food was strange and alarming indeed, but it was not the whole story, and the medieval table also held real skill, real flavour, and real pleasure. It is only fair to acknowledge this, to balance our gentle mockery with a proper respect for the genuine achievements of the medieval kitchen, and to remember that the medieval cook, for all the peacocks and cockatrices, also knew how to make a genuinely good dinner. Let that fairer reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to consider why medieval food tasted so very different from our own. As we near the end of our wander through the strange medieval table, we might pause to ask why, exactly, medieval food was so different from our own. Why the medieval palate delighted in flavours and dishes that we would find so odd. For the strangeness of medieval food was not mere randomness or bad taste, but the product of a whole different world, and understanding it helps us to see the medieval diner not as a fool with terrible taste, but as a person shaped by quite different circumstances. Let us reflect gently on why it all tasted so strange. Much of the strangeness of medieval food came from the simple fact that the ingredients available were quite different from our own. For many of the foods we take for granted did not yet exist in medieval Europe. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no chocolate, no tea or coffee, none of the New World foods that would later transform European cooking, for these had not yet been brought across the ocean. The medieval cook worked with a quite different palette of ingredients, lacking many of the foundations of modern cooking, and this alone made medieval food a very different thing from our own. Much of what we consider basic to good food simply was not there, and the medieval cook made do with what he had, which was a rather different set of things. The strange flavours of medieval food also reflected the medieval love of display and status, for as we have seen again and again, the grand medieval dish was often designed to impress rather than to please the palate, spiced and gilded and made spectacular as a show of wealth. The heavy spicing, the gilding, the elaborate showpieces, all reflected a cuisine in which status and display counted for more than flavour, in which the important thing was to demonstrate wealth and grandeur through one's food. This meant that the grandest medieval dishes were often the strangest and least palatable, made spectacular at the expense of taste, valued for what they represented rather than how they tasted. The strangeness of grand medieval food was, in large part, the strangeness of food as display. The medieval palate itself was, moreover, genuinely different from our own, shaped by different foods and different expectations, delighting in the strong, complex, clashing flavours that we would find overwhelming. Taste is not fixed but shaped by habit and culture, and the medieval diner, raised on heavily spiced and sweetened and soured food, genuinely delighted in flavours that we, raised on quite different food, would find excessive. This was not bad taste, but different taste, a palate shaped by a different world, delighting in different things. The medieval diner would very likely find our food bland and simple and dull, just as we find his overwhelming and strange, each palate shaped by its own world and its own expectations. Understanding all this helps us to see medieval food more fairly, not as the product of fools with terrible taste, but as the cuisine of a different world, shaped by different ingredients, different values, and a different palate. The strangeness of medieval food was real, and much of it would genuinely not please us. But it was not mere foolishness or bad cooking, it was the natural product of a world quite unlike our own. The medieval diner ate as he did for good reasons, shaped by his circumstances and his culture, and his strange food made perfect sense in its own world, however odd it seems in ours. And so we may end our wander with understanding as well as amusement, seeing the strange medieval table as the product of a different world rather than simply a catalogue of culinary crimes. Let that understanding settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on the comfort of our own modern kitchens. Having wandered through so much strange and alarming and off-putting medieval food, we may find ourselves looking with new eyes upon our own kitchens and our own tables, and feeling a quiet and rather profound gratitude for the ease and variety and safety of modern eating. For if the strange medieval table teaches us anything, it is how very fortunate we are in what and how we eat today. Let us reflect gently on the comfort of the modern kitchen, a soothing thought to carry towards sleep. Consider the sheer variety of food available to us today, the extraordinary abundance and range that we take entirely for granted, so utterly beyond anything the medieval diner could have imagined. We may eat foods from every corner of the world, fresh in every season, an endless variety of ingredients and dishes and flavors available at the turn of a hand. The medieval diner, with his limited and monotonous diet, his endless bread and pottage and salted fish, could scarcely have dreamed of the abundance we enjoy, the tremendous variety that fills our tables and our shops. This abundance is a marvel, a gift of the modern world, and it is worth pausing to appreciate it, this endless variety that we so easily take for granted. Consider, too, the safety and cleanliness of our food, the refrigeration that keeps it fresh, the hygiene that keeps it clean, the knowledge that keeps it safe, all utterly beyond the medieval world. We may eat without the constant fear of spoilage, without the risks of the unhygienic medieval kitchen, our food kept fresh and clean and safe by the marvels of modern technology and knowledge. The medieval diner ate at real risk, exposed to spoiled food and unclean preparation, while we enjoy a safety he could never have known. This safety is another marvel of the modern world, another gift we take for granted, and the strange medieval table reminds us to be grateful for it, for the clean and wholesome food we enjoy without a second thought. Consider as well the simple matter of having enough, of never facing the hunger and famine that haunted the medieval world, of eating our fill without fear of want. For the medieval poor, the great problem was often simply getting enough food at all, and famine was a real and recurring threat, while we enjoy an abundance and a security that banish such fears entirely. To eat one's fill, to never face hunger, to have food always available, is a security the medieval diner rarely knew, and it is perhaps the greatest gift of all. The strange medieval table, with its hungry poor and its precarious harvests, reminds us to be grateful for the simple, profound blessing of having enough to eat. All of this, the variety and the safety and the sufficiency of modern food, is worth appreciating, worth pausing over, with gratitude, as we contemplate the strange and difficult medieval table. We who eat so well, so safely, so abundantly, are fortunate beyond anything the medieval diner could have imagined, and the strange old food of the Middle Ages, for all its fascination, reminds us how very lucky we are. As you lie there in comfort tonight, you may feel a quiet gratitude for your own well-stocked kitchen, your own safe and varied and abundant food, and for the long journey that has carried us from the strange medieval table to the comfort of our own. Let that grateful comfort settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the cooks themselves, at the heart of all we have explored. As we near the very end of our journey, let us turn from the strange dishes to the people who made them, the medieval cooks who laboured in those smoky kitchens to produce all the food we have marvelled at tonight, the strange and the spectacular and the genuinely good. For behind every dish was a real person, working hard at a difficult craft, and it is worth remembering them as we end our wander through the medieval table. Let us spare a gentle thought for the cooks behind it all. The medieval cook worked hard at a genuinely difficult craft, labouring in hot, smoky, challenging conditions to produce food for the household, a demanding and skilled occupation that deserves our respect. Cooking in the medieval world was hard physical work, done over open fires in difficult conditions, requiring real skill and knowledge and endurance. The cook laboured long hours at hot and heavy work, mastering the techniques of his craft, producing meal after meal for the household he served. It was a demanding occupation, this medieval cookery, and the cooks who practiced it were hard-working and skilled people, deserving of our respect for their labour and their craft. In the grand households, the cook might oversee a whole kitchen full of workers, a substantial operation producing food on a large scale for the great feasts and the daily meals of a large establishment. The head cook of a great household was a person of real skill and responsibility, directing a team of workers, managing a complex kitchen, producing elaborate food for grand occasions. This was a position of real importance and skill. The management of a great kitchen, and the cooks who held it were accomplished professionals, masters of their demanding craft. The grand medieval feasts we have marvelled at were the product of these skilled cooks and their teams, labouring to produce the spectacular dishes that adorned the noble table. The ordinary cook in the humble household was most often the woman of the house, who prepared the family's food as part of her endless round of domestic labour, turning out the daily bread and pottage that sustained the household. For most people, the cooking was done at home, by the women of the household, who added the preparation of food to all their other tasks, producing the humble everyday meals that fed the family. This everyday cookery, humble and unglamorous, was the real foundation of medieval eating, the daily labour that kept people fed, and the women who performed it deserve our recognition as much as the grand cooks of the noble kitchens. Behind the ordinary medieval meal was the ordinary medieval cook, most often a woman, labouring to feed her family. In remembering the cooks behind it all, we are reminded that the strange medieval food we have explored was the product of real human labour and skill, of people working hard at a difficult craft to feed themselves and others. Whether the grand cook of the noble feast or the humble housewife at her hearth, the medieval cook laboured to produce the food of the age, the strange and the spectacular and the simply sustaining. They were real people, these cooks, working hard at their craft, and the whole strange world of medieval food that we have wandered through tonight was the product of their labour. It is right that we remember them, with respect and a little gratitude, as we end our journey through the medieval table. Let that human recognition settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how they actually ate it all, the curious manners of the medieval table. Before we let the medieval table dissolve into the quiet of the night, we should spare a gentle moment for how the medieval diner actually ate all this strange food, for the manners of the medieval table were as different from our own as the food itself, and rather charming in their strangeness. For the medieval diner ate in ways that would raise a modern eyebrow, sharing and reaching and using his fingers in a manner we have long since abandoned. Let us wander gently through the curious manners of the medieval meal. The most striking difference to a modern diner would be the absence of the fork, for the fork had not yet come into use in medieval England, and the diner ate with his fingers, a knife and a spoon, but no fork at all. Food was cut with a knife and conveyed to the mouth with the fingers, or eaten with a spoon where the dish required it. But the delicate business of spearing food on a fork was simply unknown. This meant that eating was a rather more hands-on affair than we are used to, the diner handling his food directly, reaching into shared dishes, managing without the implement we consider essential. The medieval diner's fingers did much of the work that our forks do today, and eating was a messier and more tactile business as a result. Much medieval eating was also communal, with diners sharing dishes and even cups, reaching into common bowls and eating from shared trenchers in a way that we would find rather unhygienic. Food was often served in shared dishes from which several diners ate, and cups of wine or ale might be passed and shared, so that the medieval meal was a more communal and less individual affair than our own. This sharing extended to the bread trenchers that served as plates, sometimes shared between two diners, and to the general reaching and passing of a meal eaten from common dishes. To us, accustomed to our own individual plates and cups, this communal eating would seem rather too intimate, but to the medieval diner, it was simply the normal way of the table. There were, however, real manners and rules governing all this, for the medieval table was not a free-for-all, but a place of etiquette and courtesy, with careful rules about how one should conduct oneself. There were rules about how to reach into the shared dish, how to handle one's food, how to behave courteously toward one's fellow diners, a whole code of table manners that governed the medieval meal. One should not, the manuals advised, grab the best bits, or double dip into the shared dish, or wipe one's fingers on the tablecloth, or commit any of the various discourtesies that a communal meal made possible. The medieval books of manners are, in fact, a source of real and gentle delight, for the very things they warn against tell us a great deal about how people were actually behaving at the table. Diners were advised not to blow their noses into the tablecloth, not to pick their teeth with their knives, not to scratch themselves or lean their elbows in the food, not to gnaw a bone and put it back in the shared dish, not to spit across the table, and not to stuff so much into their mouths at once that they could not answer if spoken to. That such advice needed to be written down at all suggests that a good many medieval diners were doing precisely these things, cheerfully and often, and that the well-mannered guest was the exception rather than the rule. There is something wonderfully human in this, in the image of the medieval etiquette writer, patiently explaining that one really ought not to spit one's bones back into the communal stew, and it brings the medieval table vividly and comically to life. These rules of courtesy reveal that the medieval diner, for all the sharing and the finger-eating, took the manners of the table seriously, observing a real etiquette of courteous eating. The manners of the medieval table, then, were different from our own but not absent, a real code of courtesy governing a meal that was more communal, more tactile, and more hands-on than we are used to. The medieval diner ate with his fingers from shared dishes, but he did so according to rules of courtesy and etiquette that made the meal a civilized occasion rather than a scramble. It is another charming instance of the difference of the medieval world, the strange manners of the table matching the strange food upon it, a whole way of eating quite unlike our own. And it completes our picture of the medieval meal, from the strange dishes to the manner of their eating, a world of food and dining quite wonderfully different from our own. Let those curious old manners settle gently in the dark. We turn now to our final gentle thought, the thread that connects their table to our own. As our long wander through the strange medieval table draws toward its close, let us hold one final gentle thought, a thought that reaches across all the centuries between the medieval kitchen and our own, and finds, in the end, a warm and human connection. For all the strangeness of their food, the people of the Middle Ages sat down to eat much as we do, and in that simple shared act we may feel our kinship with them across the long centuries. Let us reflect gently on the thread that connects their table to ours. For all the strange dishes we have marvelled at tonight, the medieval diner sat down to his meals with the same basic human needs and pleasures that we know, the need to be fed, the pleasure of a good dinner, the comfort of a full belly, the joy of eating with others. Beneath all the differences of food and flavour, the medieval meal served the same human purposes as our own, nourishing the body and gladdening the heart, bringing people together around the table. The medieval diner enjoyed his food, shared it with his fellows, took comfort and pleasure in a good meal, just as we do, and in this shared experience of eating, we are connected to him across the centuries. However strange his food, the medieval diner was, at table, recognizably human, and recognizably like ourselves. The gathering around the table to share food is one of the great human constants, connecting people across all times and places. And the medieval diner knew it as well as we do, the warmth and fellowship of the shared meal. The medieval feast, for all its strange dishes, was a gathering of people sharing food and company, and the humble family meal, for all its humble fare, was a moment of togetherness and comfort. This gathering around food, this sharing of the meal, is something we share with the medieval diner across the centuries, a human constant that binds us to them despite all the differences of what was actually on the table. In the shared meal, we and the medieval diner are kin, participants in one of the oldest and most human of activities. And the pleasure of food itself, the simple delight in a tasty dish, in a good dinner, in the flavors we love, connects us to the medieval diner as well, for he too delighted in his food, even if his tastes were different from our own. The medieval diner savored his favorite dishes, looked forward to his treats, took real pleasure in good food, just as we do, even though the food he loved was so different from ours. This delight in food, this pleasure of the palate, is another human constant shared by the medieval diner and ourselves across the gulf of centuries, however differently our tastes may run. In our shared love of a good meal, however different our idea of one, we are connected to the medieval diner across the long years. There is something warm and gentle in this thought, this sense of connection across the centuries to the people who sat down to those strange old meals so long ago. They are gone now, every one of them. The medieval cooks and diners, their feasts long ended, their kitchens long cold, all of them long at rest across the great gulf of the centuries. But they ate and drank and gathered around the table as we do. They knew the pleasure of food and the warmth of the shared meal. They were part of the long human story of eating that continues in us. And so we may end our wander with a sense of kinship as well as wonder, connected to the medieval diner by the simple, human, universal act of sitting down to eat. Let that warm connection settle gently over you now, soft and calming in the dark, as we prepare at last to let the whole strange feast go and drift away into sleep. We turn now, at last, towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently, the whole long feast we have wandered through tonight. The entire strange and wonderful spread of the medieval table. Let it fade, the way the past fades, the way the centuries dissolve into a soft and shapeless distance, the spiced and gilded dishes, the peacocks and the subtleties, the eels and the pottage and the endless salted fish, all growing dim and quiet and far away, until there is only the soft dark and your own slow breathing and the gathering tide of sleep. Let the medieval feast grow quiet and distant now. Let the great hall fall silent, the fires die down, the smoky kitchen settle into the deep stillness of the vanished past. Let the whole strange spread of the medieval table, all its spice and spectacle and strangeness, drift gently away into the depths of time, all of it long over now, all of it long cleared away, many centuries into the silence of the past. They are gone now, every one of them, the cooks and the diners, the feasters and the hungry poor, their meals long since eaten, their tables long since cleared, generation upon generation at rest in the deep past. And there is a great soft quiet, where all their feasting once was. Let them rest, gently, in the peace of the long-vanished centuries. And now, at last, so may you. Feel the warmth and comfort of your bed, soft and safe around you. Feel how far you are from all that strange old food, how safe, how comfortable, how gently held by the quiet of your own night. There is nothing you need to carry from all we have explored, no strange dish to trouble you, no salted fish or jellied flesh or gilded peacock to disturb the calm of your rest. Only the soft dark and the deep quiet and the simple comfort of your own warm bed, many centuries away from all that we have touched upon tonight. Feel your breathing slow and your body soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip, one by one, and drift away into the warm dark, until there is only you and the quiet and the deepening peace. and feel, perhaps, a quiet gratitude as you lie there, safe and comfortable, for the gentle abundance of your own table, so far removed from the strange and difficult food of that distant time. You are safe, and you are comfortable, and you are well fed, in a world of such variety and safety and plenty as the medieval diner could never have dreamed. There is nothing to fear and nothing to trouble you, only the soft surrender to sleep, the gentle sinking down into the warm and shapeless dark, where all is quiet and peaceful and well. The whole long feast we have travelled, the whole strange spread of the medieval table, can simply be set down now and released, dissolving into the soft dark, leaving you weightless and at peace, drifting gently down into sleep. And if any last image still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some gilded peacock in its feathers, some pie full of fluttering birds, some great sugar castle gleaming on the feast day table, let it grow soft now, and slow, and distant, the way a dream dissolves as you slip past its edge into sleep, the images dimming, the feast fading, the whole medieval table dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the centuries themselves, out into the quiet and gone. Good night, traveller. The strange old feast is long over now, the fires long cold, the tables long cleared, all of it long since passed into the silence of the deep past, across the great gulf of the centuries, and you are safe, and warm, and well fed, here in the gentle quiet of your own night, many centuries away. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.